Cool. So hello, ng-conf. It's actually my first time here and immediately on the stage, so I'm super happy about that. And before we dive directly into my talk, I would like to know, how many of you have heard about NX? Yeah. Cool. How many are using it right now? Awesome. Cool. So we are going to talk a bit today about actually fine-tuning your Angular workflow, and we're going to using NX a bit about here to how to do it with it. So I've been around since Angular 1.3-ish, kind of. So I've been around for a long time in Angular community. And I also vividly remember the Angular 2 beta versions. And why I do so is because, as Steven mentioned it earlier today, there was no Angular CLI, right? So you had to set up everything on your own. You had to kind of get starter projects, clone, but as we all know, with starter projects, sometimes they're out of date, they don't really work, so you need to fix them. And plus they're static, right? So you download them, and then you need to evolve them on your own. And quite later a bit, what happened is exactly Angular CLI got released. So the team used it, dived into it, invested into it, and I think that was one of the biggest moves from the Angular team side, because it really lowered drastically the entry barrier for new folks, right? Because you didn't have to mess around with Webpack and make sure you set it up correctly until you saw something on your browser screen. And that's what I like about it, right? You can just get it downloaded, kick up a new workspace, run it in the browser immediately in a couple of minutes, right? And so you immediately see something, and then you can iterate on it. So it really can be immediately productive and do what actually matters to you. And then later maybe dive in and have a look at the underlying tooling and how it actually works, and you fine-tune it and you work with it. So my name is Juri Strumpflohner. I'm a Google developer expert in web tech and in Angular. I'm also publishing courses on Egghead. And right now I work at NX. And so a lot of you already know apparently what NX is, but for those that don't, we are a fully open source tool that focuses on developer productivity. That's really our mission. So we want to make sure to make your life much easier when you work with Angular, but even beyond that. And we're kind of known from the monorepo space, so that's kind of our specialty, that's where our main focus is. But recently we also introduced what we call standalone projects. Now, not to be confused with standalone Angular API projects, but basically single workspace projects, right? So just like what the Angular CLI produces for you, but using NX. And this is actually how it started quite a while ago. And so we actually were initially just a schematic on top of the Angular CLI. So this is how you bootstrap an NX workspace. We kind of did some configuration on top of the Angular CLI to make it work better in kind of a monorepo scenario, so with applications and libs and multiple things of that. And since then, we have really gone deep into the rabbit hole of looking at developer productivity, CLI tooling, and what we can do there. And so we have really grown huge in the past. So we have a lot of integration with different tooling beyond even Angular. So we have tooling also beyond Webpack. So we integrate with ESBuild, Vite. We also are having support for RSpec. And obviously, TypeScript is still a main thing that we're pushing forward. And even outside that, so integrations with Cypress, with Storybook. We talk a lot of those teams to make sure these things fit together in the most optimal way. And as mentioned, even outside Angular. So we have a lot of React users, but even backend users with Node, and even beyond the JavaScript world. So we really can expand at that. And so at a high level, if you look at the architecture right now, this is what it would roughly look like. So you have a bottom layer, which is an NX npm package, which is kind of the core. And you could literally just take that and use that and manage the rest of you on your own. And that would give you kind of benefits of caching, fast parallelization, distribution, all those things. And on top of that kind of core layer, we then build all the various things that we have. There is the NX console editor extensions for VS Code and WebStorm, even NeoVim if you're into Vim, NX Cloud, the whole CI pipeline optimizations, and then there's the whole plugin section. They usually go deep into a very specific technology. And that's exactly what I would like to focus on today a bit, around the whole topic about the extensibility. So how can we take an NX workspace and customize it such that it works best for us? Now, if you look at these names here, they might not immediately sound familiar, but it's just kind of other type of names for concepts you might already know. So generators is just another word for schematics. Executors is just another word for builders. And code migration is really a similar version of ng-update, right? So you still can leverage all those things in an NX workspace. And so what does a plugin look like? It's just an npm package. And so once you install that, you have generators potentially available if that plugin exposes those, that you can then just run on the command line. As you can see, very similar to the ng generate command. Or you have executors, so-called builders, that you just integrate in the configuration that then runs tasks for specific projects. But before we go into generators and executors specifically, let's look at the basis of how they work. And this is the Nx Devkit. So we have a dedicated development toolkit for building those type of extensions and automations for our workspace. What does that have? Well, it has the primitives that allow you to extend Nx, right? And that can be things like utility functions for working with configuration files, so reading what projects are in the workspace, adding new configuration, modifying that, updating that, removing that, or working with Nx-specific configs, obviously, like the Nx.json file. It also has things like the project graph access. So Nx behind the scenes, for those of you that know it, has a concept of a notion of a project graph that it uses to optimize various things as you work with it, like speeding up your CI runs, for instance. And if you create your own executor, you can actually get access to that and leverage it programmatically, which is actually really powerful. And then there's a bunch of other stuff, like ensuring that packages are installed or triggering npm package installs because you might need that as part of your generators. Obviously generating files from templates, formatting files, and iterating over files in your workspace. So basically just handy stuff that you might need when you write those extensions. So let's have a look at the generators. Now generator, as we have seen before, is a command that you run on your command line. That's where it starts. And then it gets matched usually against a schema that is written for that generator. Now the schema is exactly the same what also the Angular CLI schematics use, is for validating your generator input. So it can provide prompts for strings or for concepts or properties that you didn't provide, so it makes it easy to use them, but it can also validate whether you provided all the required properties that it needs to run. Once that works, it will pass that to the so-called generator function as one of the inputs, such that we can consume it and read those options that the user provided for us. Next, we have the actual workspace, so the file system, that gets abstracted into a virtual tree and also passed to our generator function. Now, the virtual tree is where we operate on, right? That's where we actually interact with the file system, so we write to that virtual tree, and it just happens in memory. And this is a concept that we took from the Angular Devkit, right, as a conceptual model. And this is very powerful because then you have the whole concept of dry runs, but you can also run them through to the end and know whether they work, and only then replicate that back onto the file system. So let me quickly show you how that would work on a project. And so this is a simple setup. Let me switch the color theme here. And I did this on purpose, so you know I'm using dark mode by default. So switching here for you. And so this is an Nx workspace setup, and this is what as I called before, like a single project workspace, so what we call a standalone Nx workspace. And as you can see, there's no apps and libs folder, but it's just a source folder, and that's where the app is. But it's still based on Nx. Now, to write those extensions, we are using the plugin API, even though we're not going to publish it as a proper plugin, but we just keep it in a local workspace. Now, to be able to do that, you should first have the Nx plugin package installed. Now, I did that already, just so we save some npm package install time. And when you have that, then you can then run the generator to actually set up such a plugin in your workspace. Now, I prefer not to type on stage when the fingers don't do what you tell them to do. So I'm using here Nx console, which is an extension that we provided specifically for VS Code, where you can run these generators. And so it will parse your workspace and see all the plugins that you have installed. And we have also that Nx plugin package, and so this allows us now to have a generator where we can set this up. So let's call this then just workspace extensions. You could call them whatever you want, really, right? It's up to you. And then you can, below here, you can see the dry run already, so what would happen. And so I'm just going to run this now. And so what happens here, it now creates this workspace extensions folder. I created it at the very root here alongside my source folder. You could nest it under a tools folder. That's really up to your preference. But what you see here now is it sets up just a simple project. It has a package.json, which is actual name, no really like dependencies in there, and an empty index.ts file. Because right now we didn't do anything really. The next step would be now to actually set up a generator, right? A generator function. And so we can use an Nx generator to generate a generator function. And so again, I just use VS Code, our Nx console extension. You can just right-click and click generate. You have this generator function. and then just call this custom lib. Because what I would like to create is a custom library generator, right, where I want to customize it to my needs. You can see it already selected the project where it wants to run this because I right-clicked on the source folder. So just get this generated in here. And now as a result, what we get is already all the prerequisites to have such a generator in our workspace, in this library. So it creates the generator JSON file for discovering it, which has the actual implementation and schema file. It has created this folder here. You can see here the types and actual schema. Just has a name property as the default input. And actual implementation, plus some unit tests. So here, the setup is really simple. So it literally just kind of defines a root of the project, adds some project configuration, and generates files. Now, what I would like to do is actually compose it, because very often what you want to do is like take an existing one, and we expose here actually a package called Angular generators, and that has our library generator that you would use normally if you right-click and say Nx Angular generate me a library, right? And so I want to take that as an input and just customize it to what I need. So I wait for this because an async operation, I have here library generator. Thanks, Copilot. This is neat. But what you can do here is also do some optimizations. For instance, I want to not give the user of my team the possibility to kind of choose a folder because I already know we want to have a default folder, which is like modules, for instance, right? And then you could provide other options which this generator provides. So I saved this. We don't need really this whole project configuration here. The project root would now be modules. You would probably want to have that in a variable somewhere. And now we want to generate files, right? So what I would want to do in a simple case, for instance, is take this folder here, which has already been created for me, and let's say we want to override the default README that gets generated. And so let's just create here a new file called readme.md, say hello. You can also have variables. Let's say like there's a name property that we pass via our schema. So I render this in here, and so let's say hello ng-conf. All right. And so this generate files, again, is a utility that gets exposed here via this Devkit, right? And what it does is it takes this folder here, this files folder that we have seen, and passes in the project root where it needs to generate it, plus options, which is overrides basically, which is exactly the templates that we have seen in here. So it would pass in this variable, for instance. All right, so how do I run this? Well, I can just go ahead and do it over the CLI. So take that as the name, and then go ahead and say npx nx generate. This is the name, custom lib, and let's do a dry run, just to be safe. And so now you see it runs it. It asks for the name, let's say my ng-lib, and it would then generate the file. So let's actually go ahead and just run this. The cool part here is the ng-lib. The cool part here is that this also is automatically detected by our VS Code extension. So you can use the exact same mechanism, even if this just lives locally in our file system. And so what you can see here, what we get is here this file generated, the project setup of an Angular library, plus our overridden README. So this is obviously a very simple example, but it can show you how you can compose these and actually match them together and customize it already to what you might need, right? And restrict some of the options that our generic package provides. Now, if you're interested in the specific Angular standalone setup that I've been using here, we have a brand new tutorial from last week, which walks you exactly through what this is exactly about and how you can kind of set up such a project in an optimal way. Cool. Let's pass on to the executors. So what is an executor? It's a similar scenario, but like you run tasks in this case. So you run usually the build of a project, serving a project, linting it. And so that's exactly the command you can see there. And what it then does, it takes a couple of information from your workspace. So the source files, obviously, the project graph, global configuration, runtime information, and passes it to what I call a coordinator mechanism in Nx. What that coordinator does is it checks things like caching, right? So it produces a hash code, matches it against the local cache, and if it is already present, it wouldn't even run my executor function, just restores what has run before. If that didn't happen, it's now going to collect that contextual information, take also configuration that the user provided in the configuration file, like in a project JSON, and then pass it again to my executor function. And then we also have the same notion of a schema, which we also pass in, which can provide validation against what we actually can configure on that executor. So let's again see how that differs. Again, what I'm going to do is just going in here in my workspace extension, I right-click, generate, and I say executor, right? And so what I call this is compile MD, because what I want to do is I want to compile that README file into an HTML file. So I run this, and it does kind of the same thing. So it again sets up the executor function here. We would like the different pointers to the implementation and schema. This is for discoverability by Nx and also Nx console. And then it creates me the various implementation things in here. And so you can see it's a pretty straightforward function that gets a couple of options in here and runs the tasks that you need to run, and then it returns an object that kind of gives information about errors or successful outcomes. Now, let me actually insert a snippet for this one here, because I don't want to bore you with writing like a lot of code. Let's run through this. So what happens here? I'm doing just some sanity checks initially that I get all the things that I need to run, to have. And then I'm accessing here already the first thing, which is the project configuration, right? Because I want to read what potential user configured in his project. And the context object is here, that one that we've seen before, is the key to getting access to that. So I have here all the projects that are in there, and I also have the project name. And that's how I grab that. And I need it because I want to know where is my project located, right? So for instance, my modules ng-lib is in that specific folder. So I need that because I want to go and actually take the README file from there to compile it. So I need to know that location. And that's in fact what I do here. I just use Node APIs. These are straight Node APIs. I read the file. I do whatever I need. In this case, it's kind of compiling it to HTML. I do some sanity checks again, and then I just write it to some output directory. Now, usually you read that also as part of a configuration. I just hardcode it here for simplicity. I do a bunch of stuff of actually making sure directories exist, and then simply write it actually to the file system. And that's kind of it for a very simple setup. How do we use it again? Well, again, we need to know the name of that package, which is here that ng-conf workspace extension, and then I just go there where I want to configure it for which project, right? So usually that is the project JSON, which is the equivalent thing of kind of Angular CLI, Angular JSON, and then I add a new target here. Now let me add here a snippet again, where I give it the name, obviously, of the target, how that's being called. I give it the name to the executor, and you can see here this is the package name plus the function that I want to invoke, right? The name of that executor, executor, and then I give it the outputs. The outputs is mostly for the caching to work, right? And so once I have that, I can just go ahead and run it. So I can say nx compile md, and my project is called hello. What was the name? Modules lib, ng-lib. And so if I run this, you can now see it runs, and in my dist folder now I should have that README compiled, right? Now, since this is running through the next pipeline, you get the benefit of all the things like caching and speed stuff, right? The only thing that I need to do is declare it, for instance, as a cacheable operation. So my compile MD1 will be a cacheable operation. Note that we get auto completion. This is thanks to Nx console, right? So it knows this target exists. So if I run this again now, first time it needs to compile it again because we changed it. If I run it again, it's now cached, right? So meaning if I go and delete here the README, I rerun it again, it just goes and restores it, right? So all these benefits come basically for free because you run it through the Nx processor and that coordinator mechanism that I mentioned before. So you might be asking, why should I do this, right? And it's a legit question because like in a normal small workspace, you might not really need it. But as your workspace kind of grows, it is really, really handy for enforcing best practices, kind of maybe restricting some of the options that you have such that everyone is in line. And so if a new person joins your team, they immediately know they don't have to go through docs, but they rather just know we can use Nx console or they have a list of generators and they use those and they are sure that they will set up the project in the same way as your teammates did. So it's really making Nx and Angular in this case tailored to your own needs and make it work best for you. And so as you can see, you don't have to write from scratch, but you can even compose existing ones. So use the ones that we provide. On our community page, there's also like a whole set of like over 80 community plugins that are even published. And same with the executors, right? So you could leverage the executors that we write and wrap them or just straight use them. So this is, for instance, an example of analog from Brandon Roberts, where he uses our NX executor to build specifically, as well as the servers and so on, to run analog projects, right? And if you're curious about analog, by the way, he's giving a talk right after me, so definitely stay for that. So what about the Angular Devkit? How does it compare to that? No observables, right? And we're actually fans of observables at our team, but the thing is, like, writing generators is really just a way to go through them, right? It's almost synchronous processes, you just wait for something. And so it felt much more straightforward to have an API like this one here, where you just use the wait statement, wait for the output, and then go ahead, right? So we wanted to make it more straightforward to write these. As we have seen, you also get all those NX speed features, like caching, affected commands, all that stuff for free. Free integration with our NX console extension. It just reads those local generators. And we never even had to compile those, if you paid attention. Like, we never had to kind of make sure, oh, we need to first compile those because they're written in TypeScript. But that's what NX behind the scenes does for you. So it understands this is a local generator, needs to pre-compile it and serve it right away. But you can also ship them. If at some point you say, oh, these are really valuable, we want to have it on another NX workspace as well, or even in like an Angular CLI workspace, you could totally do this. This is an NPM package. It has already built target. Compile it, wrap it, and publish it to NPM or some other registry, just as any other NPM package. Questions usually come up also, like, what is the compatibility? Like, I might want to still use Angular schematics and kind of cross-use them. Yeah. Like, first of all, you can run all Angular schematics through NX. So if you use NX generate and pass it an Angular schematic, it will totally work. We have a compatibility layer where we map things between the two different versions where they kind of differ slightly. And you can also expose your existing NX generators as schematics. There's a function there where you just wrap it, and we will kind of do the heavy lifting behind the scenes to make that work. Cool. If you want to know more about plugins specifically or that type of automation, we have a dedicated section on our docs, which has all the stuff around videos and like deeper dive tutorials around how to create such a setup, which I've shown today really quickly. And the too long, didn't listen kind of thing is, don't be scared, right? Look into it, try it, use one of the generators, play around with it and see how they work. They seem intimidating initially because I'm not a plugin developer, right? But it's not that difficult actually after all. Cool. Thanks for your attention. Get in touch. We're also outside of the booth, so come talk to me. Thanks.